Hello and welcome everyone to my review of the new Against All Logic album 2017 to 2019. Against All Logic is the moniker of electronic music producer Nicholas Jar, and back in 2018 he blessed our ears with the first album under this name. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, but 2012 to 2017, which was the name of the previous album, separated itself from the pack without doing anything crazy in a stylistic sense, but rather just working with incredibly textured and crisp sounds, making sure each track was as detailed and interesting as each other, and finally introducing some pretty creative sampling chops into the mix. Over the course of 11 tracks, he strung together a pretty excellent, incredibly smooth and slightly vintage house record. On this new album, Nicholas is clearly allowing himself a little more creative freedom while still keeping the core of what made the previous album good. All the flashy sampling, the detailed progressions and the textured sounds return, but I would hesitate to call this a house record. Many of the sounds are somewhat harsher at times. On a couple of tracks like With an Addict, the percussion is a lot busier, almost coming off like something Aphex Twin would put together on one of his more IDM tracks. And when combining these two elements, I think the end result is an album that's a lot more urgent in feel. This change is apparent right from the get-go with the excellent opening cut Fantasy. I love the crackling backing beat, the hanging bass and the super catchy vocal sample on this track. I feel like all of these elements could have fit snugly onto the first album, but after a spacious break in the middle of the song, some of those stranger sounds come into the fold, including some synths that would sound pretty at home on like a PC music cut. The next track, If Loving You Is Wrong, also feels like it could have fit onto the first record even if the core melody is just a shade darker, but I think things start getting a little more interesting at With an Addict, which I mentioned before. I love just how much energy is conveyed in the percussion here, and over the course of its 7-minute runtime, plenty gets introduced to keep the track from feeling stale or anything like that. In particular, I like the gorgeous bright synths that come in close towards the end of the track. Alarm is another song that I feel moves in a slightly more creative direction with its like danceable but much more aggressive aggro vibe. In fact, just generally after this song, I kind of feel like each track brings its own distinct vibe to separate itself from each other track on the record. I would say that Nicholas is almost taking a hint from one of his older records, Space's Only Noise, by giving the listener a kind of assortment of sounds in this mixtape style, even if the sounds are a little bit more bombastic than on that record. While I am really glad that this record mixes everything up and didn't just rehash ideas from the first album, at the same time this does bring the only issue that I have with the record, and that's that with such a mix of sounds and ideas, not everything feels quite as incredibly crisp and eargasmic as it did on the first album. Every now and again I catch a sound that just stands out a little amongst the mix. I think the worst track for me is probably the song Divas. On this track, the beat is constructed with what sounds like a very distorted set of hi-hats and snares and just various percussion. It all just kind of crackles away in the background. I don't think this track is bad by any stretch, by the way. I would actually say it's one of the most detailed on the album, with a huge array of interesting sounds blended into the mix, and the majority of the track is guided by this kind of dark and urgent bass rumble. I just think that on this track there's kind of like a level of polish that maybe didn't quite make it as high as it could have. With that being said, the very next track, Faith, is one of my favourites in the track listing, and as it's the only other song to hit the 7-minute mark, I'm really glad it panned out so well. I adore the core melody and percussive flair, and even if the first half of the track is a little sparse, it develops nicely into a pretty spacey jam, finally being sent off with an almost ambient piano outro. The final two songs on the album, Penny and You Forever, bring a slightly lighter, almost hopeful vibe to the end of the record. I enjoyed both, but I don't really have that much to report. Penny is another decent long song, even if it is perhaps a little less interesting or eventful than most of the songs. And while You Forever is the most low-key cut on the record, I still feel like the core of what makes the rest of the songs great end up showing up here. So in conclusion, this is just another great record from Against All Logic. To me, it's an 8 out of 10. I'm glad he mixed up the sounds, even if it means a slightly less consistent record overall. And while I think that I do prefer the first album, this one still had an impact on me, and I'm excited to listen to whatever Mr. Jar moves on to in the future. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to leave a like, it helps me out a ton, and if you feel so inclined, I do review video games and I'm planning to move on to films at some point soon, so if that sounds like your bag, make sure to subscribe as well. Cheers for watching.